Thanks a lot, Jonathan. That was really brilliant and fascinating. So we have now 35 minutes for discussion. So please use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. Achille is first.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you. So I just have a quick question about, in fact, the very last point you just discussed, the relational approach versus relational property approach. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the relational approach has the advantage that when the second relatum is the same, you get important information as opposed to unanalyzed phi and psi altogether. But I was wondering whether you've thought about a different alternative that might in fact be equally effective as relationalism, which is to treat what is in fact in your account the second relatum as some sort of sentential operator, like according to Brazilian rules. And now you've got inside the old-fashioned monadic account. In other words, some sort of fictionalist account. And I was wondering whether, if you thought about it, indeed the connection with fictionalism might be of some interest with respect not so much to the nuts and bolts of the account, but the overall approach to social constructionism that you started from. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Achille.
So, sorry to interrupt. Before you answer, can you perhaps unshare your screen so that we see each other?
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
Sorry. It's not allowing me to unshare. Let me try something.
Excellent.
Okay, good. Great. So thanks, Achille. That's a great suggestion and not something that I've worked through yet. So I'd really appreciate your thoughts in working through this. I want to separate the idea of thinking of this as an operator versus the assimilation of that to a kind of fictionalist approach. I think that those are strictly separable. Though it's sort of natural. If you want to be a fictionalist, I think it's natural to think of this as going under an operator, but you could think of it as going under an operator without then going, so there's that direction of connection. Yeah, so maybe I'll take them in reverse order. I didn't want to be a fictionalist because, well, again, a lot will depend on how you're thinking of fictionalism, because I wanted to recognize the sense in which these sort of socially constructed features are causally operative. There's this quote from Catherine McKinnon that Sally Haslinger often uses about how gendered reality, like some people say it's unreal, but it's, it's like how can you say it's unreal when it's like smacking me in the face with all the force of like a car hitting a concrete abutment. So there might be senses of fictionalism that can allow for the causal efficacy of properties. I think the main thing that I want to insist on is the causal efficacy of these social features. To the extent that that's compatible with fictionalism, then I could be okay with that sort of fictionalism, but to the extent not, I wouldn't want that kind of fictionalism for the social properties. Like maybe here's a crude way of putting it, like gender does a lot more to people than Harry Potter ever can. Okay, so as opposed to an operator style regimentation, that's I'm thinking of that, though this is maybe sort of an optional way of thinking about the formalism. I'm actually thinking of these as equivalent, where the way I'm thinking of operators as working is they're shifting intentional parameters of assessment. So the way that like a modal operator will work is like we might have like, a proposition, or we might have a claim like Achille is sitting. And we'll need to, obviously that can vary across worlds. So we'll need to know the world of evaluation. And what a modal operator can do is it can shift worlds of evaluation. But the way that I'd want to interpret that metaphysically, and this is, this is going to be controversial, I'd want to say that that just shows that the sitting relation isn't monadic, but you're only sitting, maybe relative to a world and relative to a time, or whatever parameters we want to posit. So I would actually say that what the operator is just doing is it's showing a kind of implicit relationality in the feature at issue. There's no feature of sitting, simpliciter. Given that you can be sitting at some world time pairs and not others, there's just a sitting relation that you bear to worlds and times, and all the operator is doing is bringing out implicit relationality. So in that sense, I'd want to say that again, like, this is controversial, but I'd want to say that the operator style formalism is just a notational equivalent of the rule relationalist formalism. But there's definitely room to say that there's there's substantive differences between them.
Thank you.
Yeah, Schmitz.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for the talk. So I have to say I'm a bit uneasy about this marriage between constructionism on the one hand and universal applicability on the other hand. So you argue for constructionism on the basis of variability, and then you assert it has a universal application. So I'm wondering, isn't it enough if we, of course, we have to like describe the objective situation that people say from the past have been confronted with, but then it seems for that, it might be enough to have the X features in a certain way, to speak in Searlean terms, so the physical features, if you will. And then we can talk about what statuses and so on, those people, or how they regarded these things and what statuses they opposed on it and so on. And then we can also talk about how we might classify this from our contemporary perspective in terms of our conceptual framework. So I'm sort of wondering, why isn't that enough? I mean, why isn't it enough if we say that Genghis Khan would be a war criminal by our standards, but wasn't by the standards of his times? And I think I am a little concerned about this, because I don't want to say we can't. Of course, in some sense, we're happy that we're not living in Genghis Khan's times anymore, and that we think we have made more progress, and I think that's all fine. At the same time, it seems wrong to me, at least, to say we could, if somebody did what Genghis Khan did in the past now, we would judge it very differently than what he did. And so I think it's in some sense, it's wrong to just simply judge people in the past by our current standards. So I was wondering what you think about that. So does this universal applicability also have these consequences in terms of application of moral standards? And to once repeat my first point, why isn't it enough that we have the physical features and can talk both about how people thought at the time and how these things look in the light of our present standards?
Great, thanks, Michael. So let me start with the first part. Why isn't it enough that we have the physical features and just how people thought about it at one time, how people thought about it the other time? In a certain sense, I think that is what rule relationalism is saying. So, Genghis Khan is actually, I'm just going to shift the example to my Lincoln example, because actually I think, just as a minor historical aside, that Khan actually was a war criminal even by the implicit standards of his day. But sorry, that's an irrelevant aside. But so I think Lincoln is a war criminal by our standards. He's not a war criminal by Liber Code standards. That's the right thing to say about Lincoln, I agree. And so then the right status to attribute to Lincoln, but then the question that I'm asking is Lincoln a war criminal or not? And I'm saying, I'm trying to ask and then dismiss that question. I think the only thing to say is that Lincoln did these acts, or order of retaliation, and those acts are criminalized by the Geneva Convention and not criminalized by the Liber Code, exactly as you say. But then what I'm trying to dismiss, Michael, is this follow-up question of like, but was Lincoln a war criminal? So I've already told you everything. There's no further question. And you might think that's trivial in the war criminal case, but think of what it implies in the case of race and gender. It implies that no one has any, it implies, you know, there are no women or no women simpliciter, no one has any race, no one has any gender, but only these racialization and genderization relations. So that's where it gets interesting. You also talked about like the normative upshots of this and how we judge people. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I think there's actually, I didn't get into that here, but there's sort of multiple dimensions of normative involvement. One is whether we accept a given set of rules as having any normative force at all. So when I look back, like in the gender case with Christy Lee Littleton, when I look back at those earlier Texas laws that by which Littleton is a man relative to those laws, I don't think those laws have any normative force at all. I mean, they had legal force, as Littleton felt tragically in her life, but normally they are, to use a technical term, bullshit. So we have to give a normative evaluation of the laws themselves, but also there's, when we get into judging people, there's certain other normative things that come in, which is that we don't tend to like to judge people by outside standards. And this is especially true in the law, where there is actually a crucial legal principle that you can't run afoul of laws that didn't exist at the time of your action. And this comes up in some like cases around World War II, where Hermann Goering was among the many war crimes that Goering, Hitler's chosen successor, was accused of, was the act of initiating an aggressive war. And like, we all want to hold Goering responsible for all sorts of things, but in fact, that law didn't exist at the time. So, you know, lots of terrible things to say about Goering, but I don't think he could have been legally responsible for violating that law just because it didn't exist at the time. So the normative upshot of rule relations is going to be complicated by by judgments about the rules, and also by this requirement that like, you got to give people a chance to be aware of the rules before you can punish them for running afoul of them. So it's complicated.
Good, Gloria.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the problem I had is maybe a bit related to what Achille said, but I have a different suggestion. And this is so I don't see yet how your relationalist account can make sense of this relation without assuming a monadic property. So you talk about a relation between an individual and a social rule. And I cannot see how this relation should be understood towards a singular, radically singular individual that is not specified by any kind of properties. And I think all the cases that you described, I wonder why don't you go like Asta in the categories we live by. So she says they are not, the relation is not to a physical property, but to an alleged or described property. And so you could also make sense of the case that in one culture, this person is ascribed the property, in another not, even though the physical world is the same. But still, I think you need some kind of property to make sense even of the second relatum in this dyadic relation. That was my thought.
Yeah, right. No, thanks, Gloria. First of all, I just absolutely agree that you need some kind of base property, and another of Asta's terms, of the individual. So like in the money case, I was thinking the base property was, you know, being printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. In some of the race cases, the base property might be having certain ancestry, or in the South African case, just having certain hair. Those are going to be the base properties. But I think there's an important distinction that Asta's treatment important notion that Asta's treatment does not make sense of, which is the phenomenon of passing. This is the phenomenon where someone might, take the example of Walter White, that former head of the NAACP, who has significant, like 30% African ancestry. So by US rules, the Jim Crow era is racialized as Black, but crucially, people couldn't see that, you know, they couldn't read that off his skin. And so he passed as white and used his ability to pass as white to do these amazingly brave and wonderful things of like infiltrating the Ku Klux Klan and like, wow. On Osta's account, where it's just an alleged property, there's no, white would just, in those, like when he's infiltrating the Klan, they would just confer the status of being white on him. And so he would just shift to being white. Sorry, it's a little confusing because being white is his name and his racialized status. Walter White would just shift to being white in those contexts. I think that's just the wrong description and would make the phenomenon of passing that people like Ron Mallon and others have discussed in some length. It just doesn't properly account for that. So that's why I want there to be like a physical base property and not just an alleged one.
Sorry, Brian, I shut my mic. Sorry for this. Brian, you're next.
I've had a lot of opportunity to talk to Jonathan about this stuff, so I think I actually ought to pass to the next person because I'm interested in hearing what other people have to say and don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Hi, Brian. Good to see you.
You too.
Run.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hey, Jonathan, thanks for that talk. I want to ask you, I think, something about grounding. So it seems like you could make a rule relationist move, say, about a scientific disagreement, like such and such counts as an example of heat by this person's theory or by this person's paradigm and not by this person's paradigm. And of course we make that move all the time when we're trying to understand theoretical disagreements and so on. So in those cases, in some cases you do want to just say they're talking past one another, and in some kind of cases you want to say one of them is wrong and one of them is right. It seems to me like it's an interesting feature of a lot of these social constructionist cases that they're putatively natural kinds. That is, most people think of gender as determined by sex, and they think of race as determined by some underlying racial ancestry or essences or something. So why would it be in these cases that are of interest to you and me, on your view, that the rules would be what determined the right? There'd be an utterance and it would be right according to some in relation to some rule. Why would that be the thing that determines the truth of the utterance? I mean, I take it that that's going to be the view, as opposed to some what people think it is some natural fact about the world, on your view.
Right, great, Ron. So that's a great question. I want to first just separate the sort of the metaphysics, which is what I was talking about. I should have said this in the talk, from any semantic claims about sort of how various, if Sam says that Robin is Black, like is that true? Do we look at what rules are going to, by the rule relationist lights, are going to come into evaluating Sam's claim? The rules that Sam endorses, the rules that Robin's society endorses, the rules that we, the evaluator, there's different ways of doing the semantics relative to rule relationalism. What I did want to speak to, I'm still processing your question. I feel like what I'm going to say might not be fully responsive. The idea that these are putatively natural kinds, I think, is a potentially very important feature of certain rule systems, maybe most of them. So what it might be is that the actual rule that was operative in, let's say, the US Jim Crow era wasn't just that if you have any African ancestry, then you count as Black, then you're racialized as Black, but that if you bear this like natural stamp given by, that's sort of passed along through the, through African ancestry, then you count as Black. In which case the rule will be a rule that no one ever satisfies the conditions for. So, and I think this is the kind of thing that you in the vicinity of the kind of things that you like in some places, this might be a kind of empty rule that sort of on which, and this is connecting a little bit to Gloria's, the discussion on Gloria's question, where it might be that we classify certain people, certain people might pass as white or Black by that rule because we think naively that there are these natural kinds and they fall under them. But in fact, the rule might be empty in its application and sort no one into any box whatsoever. And we might, all of us, be fall under the none of the above box relative to that. So it is part of rule relationalism that there will be these rules that have null application because they embody false presuppositions about what the world is like. And you could make, and might very well successfully make, the historical case that a lot of the existing rules have null application. So that's consistent, maybe not with the way I was giving the examples, but it is consistent with the sort of formal apparatus of rule relationalism and might turn out to reveal a very important truth about the just false mindset through it, especially race concepts work.
Thank you.
Thomas is next.
Yeah, thanks very much. So this relates very closely to stuff I've been working on myself recently, also my talk at this conference. So this was quite useful. There's one aspect of this sort of question that's been puzzling me a little bit, and it's how analogous we should treat the sorts of cases in which we, sort of counterfactuals about the social world, where we say, like, if our rule were such and such, then the facts would come out such and such, and just descriptive claims about how things work according to other cultures, let's say, right? So someone, you might say, so this person is Black by Brazilian rules or something, but you might also say, like, if our rules about classifying people according to race had evolved in such and such a way, we would be classifying this person in this way. Now, you could treat those in exactly the same way in this sort of relationist framework. So in both cases, they're just sort of Black or what have you in relation to some rule and not in relation to some other rule. But you might think that you might also want to draw a distinction there in that there's in some sense the fact that I count as white according to the Brazilian rules, that's a sort of sociological fact that's sort of real and actual. Where sort of merely counterfactually the case that I would count as white by some other rule or something like that. And you might want to have that show up in the metaphysics somewhere. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on that sort of thing.
Yeah, great, Thomas. Actually, I think I completely agree that that's important to track the distinction between, actually I want to make, this is something that Robin Dambroff and I have been talking about, and they helped me see that there's actually, I think, a tripartite distinction that's worth making between the rules that are enforced in a given locale. It's really important to track. I mean, great, like, hey, you're white by Brazilian rules, but like, what does that do for you? It really matters whether you're in Brazil to know, like, whether that's, what that's going to do for you or to you. There's the rules that are enforced, but also I think it's worth distinguishing, this is something that Robin helped me see, between the rules that are merely counterfactual and those that are found in other parts of the world. Yeah. And part of what's important about that is it gives kind of political hope. So finding that a rule is not just an abstract possibility of classification, but one that actual people use in other parts of the world shows that there's a kind of psychological possibility of people using it even here and now. So if you find that the rules that are, like consider, Texas, the earlier Texas rules that I think are horrible, by classifying people like Christy Lee Littleton as being a man. If all the rules found throughout the world classify trans people as just men, that can lead to a kind of hopelessness and inaction, in the sense that we might start feeling like, well, even if there are these other abstract counterfactual rules that would go differently, like actual humans, for whatever psychological reason, maybe can never glom onto those rules. But once we see that those other better rules have been embraced by people, or even subcommunity, even small subcommunities, then that gives hope that, like, hey, this could spread.
Yeah, thanks.
Robert.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you.
Hey, Robbie.
So I was thinking about some quantified cases of talking about money. So like all the objects in this box I have are money, where that contains US dollars and Norwegian kroner and maybe British pounds and so on. And so, I mean, obviously the prima facie puzzle, if you're a relationist here, is that there's no one rule such that all of these are money by that rule. So it looked to me like you need to understand those kind of claims to have this some kind of notion of belonging, some kind of way you could take an object and look at what rule it belongs to. So maybe kind of the origin of each of these artifacts will give you the kind of the culture which is the relevant money rule. And then you can understand the quantified claim as saying, look, all the objects in this box are money by the lights of the rule, relative to the rule that they belong to. Then I was thinking that once you've got the belonging rule in the game, there's this other salient monadic property, which is just built on top of the ontology that you've defended here, which is just something's money if it's money by the lights of the rule that it belongs to. And now there's a competition between whether we should prefer a sort of free-floating relational thing, or at least in a case-by-case basis, this kind of deparameterized monadic thing, if we can make sense of this notion of belonging. So I was just wondering what you felt about that choice point.
Great, thanks, Roddy. That's great. So let me first talk about the quantified claims, and then I'll talk about this choice point about sort of monadic belonging. So with respect to the quantified claims, there's a sense in which I haven't said enough to give you a way to evaluate the real relationalist consequence, because and this came up with Ron, I think it was Ron's question, I didn't say anything about the semantics. This is sort of quite naturally paired with a contextualist semantics, but since I think that, at least for race and gender, we should think of social constructionism as also coming with an error theory. It also quite naturally pairs with all our claims are false because they embody the false presupposition that these are natural and immutable properties. This also came out in discussion with Ron. So what I actually, just taking this opportunity to say a little more about how I'm thinking of the semantics before I go forward, I'm actually thinking of a lot of social predicates as analogous to how I think of predicates of rest and motion, which is I'm going to distinguish now between an unrepaired and a repaired semantic value. So I think if I just say something's at rest or something's in motion, I think the unrepaired semantic value of that is attributing just a monadic property of rest or motion to a thing, and we naively think the world offers up such properties, but it's a discovery of relativity that there are no such, the world just doesn't offer up such properties. It only offers up rest and motion relations to frames of reference that the folk, weren't taking into account and had no conception of. So we need to have something like a repaired semantic value where we, the interpreter, then hand write in something like a salient frame of reference and hand expand the predicate from monadic to binary. So now we're sort of, in some sense, charitably reinterpreting the person in ways that they didn't intend, as if they were speaking of these like Einsteinian properties, these complex Einsteinian properties. I think so social constructionism is taking us to the same place. So we have these monadic properties of like, you know, being a woman, being Black. But it's a discovery of social theorists that these features are not natural and immutable monadic properties, but these variable socially constructed features. And so there's the unrepaired semantic value of Sam as a woman, which I think is just a falsity, because it attributes a monadic property of being a woman to Sam, and the world offers up no such monadic property. And then there's the repaired contextualist semantic value, which might take into account something like the implicit attitudes of the speaker, which rules they were sort of implicitly operating with in classifying Sam. So when we get to the quantified cases, the unrepaired semantic value, sorry, now this was a bit long-winded, but I wanted to say something about the semantics, otherwise I can't say anything about these quantified cases. The unrepaired semantic values are just going to be false because it's attributing these monadic properties that don't exist. The repaired semantic values are going to be treated in a contextualist way. So we'll have in logical form this additional rule parameter in the repaired semantic value that can be bound by the quantifier. So all our money can be, you know, this one's money by this, by sort of the rule that naturally it bears, it belongs to, that one's money by the rule that it naturally belongs to. So that's how a kind of contextual semantics can take up exactly a kind of notion of belonging through a kind of a bound reading of the quantifier. But then you point out, well, but there's this opportunity, now getting to the second part of your question, to bring in a monadic property of, you know, of belonging. And that is the extreme ontological localist Glasgow option. Because there, as Sandra, assuming that belonging, that what it, so I guess you could say you belong to, there's different ways of thinking of belonging now. One is like just where something first came into being. And the other is the rules that are enforced on something wherever it happens to have gotten to. So I guess take the case of Sandra Lang as she travels from South Africa to Brazil to the US. If it's just whatever rules were in place at the start, it's the original, it's the 1950s South Africa Population Registration Act that's always sitting on Sandra. No matter how things change, she's always stuck being, she's always stuck being Black. That doesn't fit her social reality as it evolved. Or you could have this shifty one that it's whatever grid she's under that takes her from, you know, as she travels around to different races, and then I have, we can talk more about that, but that was my complaints against the extreme ontological localism.
Good, so we have time for one last very short and question and answer if possible, because Brian's talk starts just after. So Carl, you have the mic, and sorry to Dan and Michael for not being able to take your question. Carl.
Thanks. I'll try to be very quick. So I guess I just wanted to a little bit more about where the sharedness is staying in the relational view. You might have partially answered this already. So
I didn't hear you.
The sharedness is staying in the relational view. So rather than having the relational properties, keeping them as relations, given the close relationship to the rules in what you're saying, it's hard to see where being racialized as Black according to rule set 1 and racialized as Black, not racialized as Black according to rule set 2. What is the, can we not still ask the question, what is it to be racialized as Black relative to a rule set? And how do we then approach that? Or do we kind of end up having to say there's no answer to that question? In the same way as you wanted to say there's no answer to is Genghis Khan a war criminal or Lincoln a war criminal, simpliciter?
Can you answer that in 30 seconds, Jonathan? Can you answer that?
What I think is that there's commonalities about being racialized as Black, of exactly the kind Haslinger talks about across rule systems. At least it's very often to be oppressed in certain ways. There's certain, this is getting into dynamic issues as well. There's common power structures imposed upon people as a result of being racialized or gendered in different ways across different systems. So empirical claim, there are these important commonalities to be captured by having this general relational notion of being racialized as Black.
Excellent. Many thanks, Jonathan, again, for that great talk and that excellent conversation. Thanks to you all, and see you all very soon, perhaps in the next talk in this afternoon.